This is the word of the Lord. There were some Greeks in town who had come to worship at the feast, and they approached Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee. "Sir, we want to see Jesus. Can you help us?" Well, Philip went and told Andrew, and Andrew and Philip together went and told Jesus, and Jesus answered them, "Time's up. The time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified, so listen carefully. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it is never worth any more than a grain of wheat. But if it is buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. So in the same way, anyone who holds on to life just as it is destroys life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. And if any of you wants to serve me, then follow me. Then you'll know where I am, ready to serve at a moment's notice. And the Father will honor and reward anyone who serves me. But right now, I am storm-tossed. What am I going to say? Father, get me out of this? No. This is why I came in the first place. I'll say, Father, put your glory on display. Today we are talking on the subject of brokenness. And I believe that all of us here, if you haven't yet, you're going to have a time in your life where you will face a situation that causes us to wonder, how in the world am I ever going to get through this? How am I going to make it? I found a quote from Tommy Lasorda. Many of you recognize the name. He's a former baseball coach for the Los Angeles Dodgers. And he said this about his troubles. He said, "I found it's not good to talk about my troubles because 80% of the people who hear them don't care. And the other 20% are glad that I'm having them." We all find different ways to approach trouble in our lives, right? We've all heard the familiar letter from the daughter that's off at college, and she says, "Sorry, Mom and Dad, I'm not writing on the stationery that you bought for me. I'm writing on school stationery. That's because of the fire we had in the dorm. I lost everything in the fire, but my boyfriend gladly invited me to come and stay with him. And he found a job for me at work, the place where he works. I'm a waitress now at the Red Dog Saloon. And by the way, your granddaughter will be here next fall to greet you." Page 2. "Sorry, Mom and Dad, none of that's true. But I do have a C in English and I'm failing history. Love, your daughter." You see, we all have different ways to go about expressing our troubles, don't we? Well, in this story, next week is Palm Sunday. And Jesus in the life is in this place where the crowds are shouting praises to him. They're looking at him as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And 1 week later, they realized that he wasn't going to be the king they thought he was going to be. That he didn't come riding on a stallion conquering the enemies. They found him broken, a sacrifice, hanging on a tree. You see, brokenness is a process of maturity. If you read through the New Testament account of the life of Christ and his ministry, you'll discover that several times prior to this moment, Jesus said, "My time has not yet come." But in today's text, he said, "Time's up." In other words, my time is here. The time is ready. And not only had his time come, but I believe Jesus sees this as an opportunity to teach a lesson to his disciples and all those who are here. Can you sense the importance of this moment? I mean, Jesus is about ready to face death. He is about ready to go through a false trial. All of the lies and the innuendos about him, the beating, the abuse, and yes, the impending execution was facing him. And it wasn't a politically correct execution like we think of today. No, it was a torturous, painful, bloody execution. But Jesus sees this as an opportunity to teach. So he teaches a lesson on brokenness. And he's simply telling us that life is going to be filled with times of brokenness, because we're all going to face challenges in this life. And he uses the illustration, listen carefully. It's like a grain of wheat. If it simply remains a grain of wheat, it will do nothing. But if it's buried in the ground, if it's broken and dead to the world, it will sprout and rise up and produce a whole harvest of grain, multiplying itself over and over and over. And you with your life must do the same thing. If you hang on to it just as it is, you're going to lose it. But if you give it up to God and you love lavishly like God has loved you, then you're going to know life. You're going to know real life. You're going to know a productive life. A life that will reproduce His love over and over and over again for all eternity. You know, generally speaking, I think of like a diamond. Or maybe even gold would be a good example. That if you took a rare gemstone, a diamond, and a grain of wheat, and you put them in a container and locked them in a safe, and opened the safe up 100 years later, that diamond could be worth exponentially more than it was when you put it away 100 years ago. But that grain of wheat is still going to be worth simply nothing. It's just a grain of wheat. I mean, if you did it for 1,000 years, it would even be all the more. But if you took that grain of wheat and you planted it in the soil and it produced a shock of wheat, and then you took all those grains and planted them in the soil and produced another and another and another over a period of 100 or even 1,000 years, you would have more grain than the earth could even contain. You see, its production represents a monetary value that makes the diamond or the gold pale in comparison. To save that grain of wheat would have been to lose everything that it was capable of producing. You see, Jesus was trying to teach us that God uses broken things. That's the God that we serve. You see, it takes broken soil, does it not, to produce a crop. It takes broken clouds to make it rain so the crop will grow. It takes broken grain to produce bread for us to eat. And it takes broken bread for it to produce strength in us. You see, it was a broken jar of perfume that poured out a blessing on the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think of the Apostle Peter, how broken he was. He wept bitterly after he had denied his Lord 3 times. But yet through that brokenness, Peter returned and was resurrected to a power and an effectiveness that established the church as we know it today, more than he could have ever imagined. You see, brokenness is the surrender of our heart, soul, mind, and body to Christ. Brokenness is what we allow God to make out of us through that brokenness. God uses broken things. And the reason He uses that brokenness is so, first and foremost, He can produce wholeness within us. I read an account about Dwight Moody sharing with us the happiest man he knew on this earth. A man by the name of Dundee from Scotland. Elderly in years now, but when he was a 15-year-old lad, he fell and broke his back. And he lied in bed all these years, and every time they had to move him, it was with lots of pain. He didn't have a day go by all of those years without acute pain of some kind. But day after day, the grace of God granted to this man. So much so, when Mr. Moody would walk into his room, he quoted and said, "I have never been closer to God than I was when I was in Dundee's room praying with him." It was like the protection and the power and the presence of God was stronger there than he had ever encountered anywhere else. So much so that he was curious to ask the man, "You know what? God is so powerful and so strong right here. I'll bet you that even Satan the tempter doesn't mess with you, does he?" And the man said, "Oh, you're wrong, Mr. Moody. He does. He tries to tempt me all the time. I'll lay here where I can see out on the street and see one of my classmates driving along, and Satan says, if God were so good, he could have kept you from falling and broken your back. Why have you even been alive all of these years?" he'd say to me. "You could have been a rich man. Or then I'll see another one of my friends walking by that I knew when I was young, and he's in perfect health, and Satan whispers to me, if God loved you, couldn't he have kept you from breaking your back? Moody said, so what do you do? What do you do at that time when the tempter comes? And he said, I just take him to the cross. I show him Jesus. I show him the scars on his hand, his feet, and his side. I said, he loves me. All by the grace of God. Through this man's brokenness, he was made whole. He was made complete in spite of his circumstances. You see, it's not unusual for people who go through those broken times of life only to discover that, wow, I'm closer to God right now than I've ever been. And I think we've all said that at one time or another, haven't we? Through the brokenness, he makes us whole. God uses broken things also to empower us. I found an account of a disciple in the Discipleship Navigator, a man by the name of Joseph Ton, was a pastor in Romania. And he was arrested by the Secret Service Police of Romania for publishing a sermon that called for all of the churches in the area to refuse to submit to the communist government's demand for control over their churches. And when an official told him that he must renounce his sermon, he said, I will not. And the official was surprised that he would respond so forcefully to a secret agent of the Romanian government. And he said, aren't you aware of the fact that I can use force against you? That I can actually have you assassinated? Let me explain, sir, Tom said. You see, your supreme weapon is killing. My supreme weapon is dying. You know, my sermons are already spread throughout the country on tapes. They've all heard them. And when you kill me, I'll only be sprinkling my blood on them. They will speak 10 times no, 100 times louder, because everybody then will say, that preacher meant it, because he sealed it with his blood. So go ahead, sir. Kill me. And when you do, I will win the victory. Needless to say, the Secret Service Police of Romania allowed the man to go unharmed, because they realized that martyrdom would do more harm than any of the sermons that were being passed throughout the country. The bottom line is, our brokenness can empower us in ways that we never thought possible. God uses broken things to bring wholeness into our lives. God uses broken things to empower us to do things we never dreamed possible. And God uses brokenness to help us learn to identify with others. A third story I discovered by a man named John Towns. He was a tall, muscular teenager that worked in the ship docks of Portsmouth, England. And on top of the mast one day on a massive ship, he fell and tumbled all the way down to the ship's deck, landing head first. And by the time all of his shipmates got to him, he was a bundle of broken bones. For 2 years, he laid in the hospital, one surgery after another, trying to pin and plate and screw his bones back together as best they could, but the pain never ceased. And finally, he was tired of all the surgeries. He wasn't completely healed, but he was crippled, and he could walk a little bit and set up some, and out of sheer boredom, he decided he'd start to read. And he discovered a Bible. And after about 3 weeks of reading the Bible, John crawled out of his room, a brand new man. He decided he was going to go look for work. And he could find somebody that would hire him in his broken, twisted condition. And he found a local shoemaker that hired him on to sit at a bench and put together shoes. Well, eventually, this man saved enough money that he could buy his own shoe shop. And he began to make shoes for underprivileged and crippled children. So much so that his shoe shop became known as the Little Children's Hospital. He burden for children because of his own brokenness in his life. And it wasn't long that he began to receive some of these poor children and take them in that were homeless. He would feed them. He would teach them to read. He would tell them all about the Lord. And his little shoe shop then became known as the Ragged School. John would limp around the waterfront with food in his pockets, looking for hungry, starving children that he could bring into his school. And in the period of life that the Lord blessed him with, from when he fell until when he died, over 500 homeless children found their way to the Lord into a successful life through John's ministry. Boys' homes, girls' homes, day schools, and evening schools were started all over England and started by the support of the government as a result of this one man's identity with people who were broken like he was. You see, he identified with them. He identified with God. One man, a broken body, turned his brokenness from bitterness to a blessing. Like Jesus said, listen carefully. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it is never any more than just a grain of wheat. But if it is buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to this life just as it is destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal life. And if any of you wants to serve me, then follow me. Then you'll be where I am, ready to serve at a moment's notice, and the Father will honor and reward anyone who serves me. But right now, I face the brokenness. Jesus said, I'm storm-tossed. What am I going to do? Ask the Father to get me out of it? Say, Dad, how about plan B? No. This is what I came to do in the first place. So, Father, glorify your name. I'll be the grain of wheat so that many can come to know you. Some of you here today are enduring the pain of life in a very real way. There's lost marriages. There's broken homes. There's death, separation, sickness, and pain. Children and grandchildren and other loved ones that have turned their back on the Lord, even though you so diligently took the time to make sure they knew all about Jesus. There's lost jobs, there's lost love, and there's lost joy. And the mountain that you see in front of you seems insurmountable. Can I remind you what God has to say about that? From Psalm the 34th chapter, hear the word of the Lord. If your heart is broken, you'll find God right there. If you're kicked in the gut, He'll help you catch your breath. Disciples, we so often get into trouble, but still God is there every time. Amen. That is a promise from God. You see, brokenness actually connects us to God. He uses the broken things in our lives so that we can identify with Him and we can identify with others. He uses the brokenness in our lives to empower us to do things that we never thought possible. And He uses the brokenness in our lives to give us that whole, complete life that He desires each and every one of us to have. And he's doing it because he wants us to spend eternity with him. You see, the bottom line is, just as we started the sermon today, it's going to end the same way. One day, Jesus is coming. And he wants us all to be ready. Let's sing it together. One day.